Today, I'm going to be talking about 3 flatwater paddling trips on the Chehalis River near the little town of Montesano, which is just a few miles east of the city of Aberdeen. There are lots of places to paddle in the Aberdeen area, with several rivers all trying to get into the Pacific Ocean. The 3 places I paddled barely scratch the surface of all the water available for a flatwater paddle trip. This portion of the Chehalis is close enough to the Pacific Ocean to be influenced by the changing tides. For all 3 locations where I paddled, the strength of the current and even the direction of the current will change as the tide varies from high to low every 6 hours. In addition to the current, the water depths you will paddle through will also change with the height of the ocean tide. As you watch this video, keep in mind that I did all 3 of these Chehalis River trips near high tide. On day 1 of my Chehalis River trips, I launched at Friends Landing on the Chehalis River and headed upstream. At least in theory it was upstream, but with the tide coming in, the current was actually flowing in the same direction I was paddling. Since this was the first time paddling my canoe in moving water, I made sure I could paddle against the current if I had to, and it was no problem. This is a fairly large river. The river banks are mostly wooded, and I didn't see many places where I could easily get out on shore. I eventually ended up at the bridge near Montesano, where Highway 107 crosses over the river. There is a boat ramp next to the bridge, and I briefly paused on shore under the shade of the bridge to drink some water. From there, I headed back towards Friends Landing, but I took a brief tour when I reached the mouth of the Wynoochee River. This was by far the most interesting part of my outing that day. In early August when I was there, the Wynoochee had unusually clear water, and I could clearly see the sunken logs at the bottom of the river as I paddled over them. The Wynoochee is also a much smaller and more interesting river than its larger cousin, the Chehalis. I regularly encountered shallow, faster-moving water that I was not able to paddle against. But the water was a pleasant temperature, and it was no problem to walk through these little rapids, pulling the canoe behind me. There were several sweepers I passed along the way, and I gave them a wide berth. I explored less than a mile up the Wynoochee before turning around and heading back to the Chehalis for the return trip to Friends Landing. One thing to keep in mind is that the Chehalis is wide enough to develop whitecaps on a windy day, and afternoon wind is a common event on the Washington coast. On day 2 of my Chehalis River trips, I again launched from the Chehalis River boat ramp at Friends Landing, but this time I paddled west until reaching Peel's Slough. I thoroughly enjoyed my time in Peel's Slough. It is a quiet, intimate place with wooded shorelines and slowly rotting pilings that I assume were used in years past to tie up log rafts. Aside from the pilings, there is little sign of civilization other than occasional trash until you reach the bridge where Caton Road passes over Peel Slough on its way to Friends Landing. It was just about high tide when I reached the bridge and turned around, and there was no current that I could easily detect. As a side note, I passed over that same bridge on my morning walk the following day. The tide was coming in at that point, and there was obvious current flooding upstream as the water level slowly rose. But back to my trip. It was breezy by the time I paddled back to the Chehalis River, and a little scary for me since I had little experience paddling a canoe out in the wind. Fortunately, I was going downwind as I headed back towards Friends Landing. But even so, I tended to seek out the side of the river with the most protection from the wind. In my experience, paddling in early August near high tide, the wind was a bigger concern than the river current. Just for fun, on my return to Friends Landing, I paddled through the inlet that takes you into Lake Queeg and used the boat ramp on the lake to get back to my campsite. There was no current in the inlet when I passed through there in the canoe. But again, the following day on my morning walk, I went over to the footbridge that passes over that inlet, and there was definitely current there heading towards the lake on the rising tide. I was learning that you really need to be thinking about the state of the tide when planning a paddling trip in this area. After I finished my Peel Slough paddle trip, I headed toward Aberdeen in the car for a few groceries and a little scouting. I was interested in doing some paddling in this area the following day, but I wasn't sure where the best put-in was located. I suppose I could launch at Friends Landing again and try to sneak through here at high tide, but I didn't know if that little inlet was passable in a canoe. Another option seemed to be the boat launch here, but it was not all that close to the area I really wanted to paddle through. So I did a little recon in the car, hoping I would get lucky, and man, did I ever get lucky. Right about here, I found a parking area with river access for anyone who can carry their boat a short distance from the parking lot to the water. Your car will need a Washington State Discover Pass to park here. From here, there is actually an established paddle route called the Blue Slough Loop, which combines Blue Slough and Preacher's Slough into a big loop trip. Although you can hear the highway in the distance, it is mostly an isolated area and a great place for a few hours of paddling. On day 3, during my paddle trip, when I got here, I made a wrong turn and headed southeast instead of northeast. Eventually, I got the feeling that I might be lost, so Google Maps to the rescue. Thank goodness for Wi-Fi and GPS, or I might still be out there trying to find my way back to the car. When I paddled back to the spot where I had made the wrong turn, I noticed an overhanging tree there that seemed to be shouting, "Go left! Go left!" I guess I need to pay more attention to the trees. There are not a lot of spots to go ashore, so I ended up having lunch in the canoe. Of course, 5 minutes after my lunch break, I headed out and passed what looked like a great spot to go ashore. Murphy's Law strikes again. As you can see from the map, there is a lot of water here that can be explored, in addition to the relatively short route that I took. The Blue Slough Loop was another great place to paddle at high tide. I have no idea what it's like at low tide. Before I end this video, let's talk about camping for a minute. I initially arrived in the Aberdeen area in the afternoon, where I stopped by a Walmart store for a few supplies and then started hunting for a campground. Lake Sylvia State Park had a campsite available for the night, so I set up the tent there. Unfortunately, my campsite and all the other campsites in the campground were reserved for the following night, so I only stayed one night at Lake Sylvia. To drive into this state park, you will need a Washington State Discover Pass for your car. There are a few stores down the road in Montesano and many more stores in Aberdeen, which is only 10 miles west on Highway 12. Since all the normal campsites were taken, I ended up in the overflow area, which was a tents-only camping area on the north side of the lake with no electricity or water. The little lakeside picnic area next door had restrooms and showers, but the showers looked pretty uninspirational to me, and they required tokens to operate. Lake Sylvia itself is little more than a large pond. There's a small roped-off area on the lake where the kids can swim in the picnic area. I suppose you could paddle around the lake if you wanted to, but you won't be going very far. There is a walking trail around the lake that's very nice. As a matter of fact, there are several trails in the Lake Sylvia area. Some were flat and well surfaced, others not so much. After that first night at Lake Sylvia, I moved my base camp 5 miles to Friends Landing Campground. At this campground, I found all of the RV campsites reserved, but none of the tent sites were reserved. This is one of the advantages of tent camping. You are not guaranteed to find a vacant campsite, but your chances of getting a site are much better than someone traveling in an RV. Friends Landing has the advantage of being right on the Chehalis River, and you can either launch your boat on the river or on a small lake that is connected to the river. The campground has nicer restrooms, and their showers take quarters instead of tokens. The tent sites have no water or electrical hookups, but there are water faucets nearby. I don't think there is anything nearby that qualifies as a hiking trail, but there is a very nice walking trail that circumnavigates the little lake adjacent to the campground. For more Flatwater Paddle Trips, check the video description below for a link to my webpage, where I have all my Flatwater Paddle Trips listed. Thanks for watching.